he rescued a Chinese woman from the river. Next day, she asked to marry him as an unexpected reward. The water was deeper than it looked. By the time Finn Riley realized something was wrong, the current had already claimed what appeared to be a delicate figure struggling against the rapids. Most men would have kept riding. Most men hadn't seen what he'd seen in those desperate movements. Not panic, but a quiet, determined struggle of someone who refused to surrender, even against drowning. She stood taller than he expected when he finally dragged her to shore, nearly his own height. Water streamed from a silk tunic that seemed to have been crafted for someone of unusual grace and status. Her eyes held a sharpness that made him step back instinctively. This wasn't just any woman. The intricate embroidery on her clothing, now muddled with silt and river water. The way she carried herself even while coughing up the river. Everything about her suggested importance. But she spoke no English. And when she looked at him, there was something in her expression that felt less like gratitude and more like a profound evaluation. She disappeared into the wilderness before dawn, leaving only faint footprints and a single, exquisitely carved hairpin beside his bedroll. Finn assumed he'd never see her again. The assumption lasted exactly 18 hours. When the sound of approaching horses reached his camp the next evening, Finn counted at least half a dozen riders. They moved with a quiet discipline, but there was something formal about their formation. At their head rode an older man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. Dressed in dark, immaculate silks that seemed out of place yet perfectly natural on the frontier, he bore the weary lines of a man who had navigated a world of challenges. The man's eyes found Finn immediately. When he spoke, his English was perfect, measured, and carried a weight that made the surrounding silence feel heavy. "You pulled a woman from the water yesterday, it wasn't a question." Somehow this man already knew. But seated on a horse just behind him was the woman herself, now dressed in dry, pristine clothing, her gaze as intense and steady as he remembered. "I have come to discuss what is owed," the old man said. The words hung in the air like smoke from a temple incense burner. But there was something in his tone that suggested this conversation was about far more than simple thanks. Something that would change everything Finn thought he knew about his solitary life on the frontier. What he didn't know was that his simple act of courage had set in motion events that would challenge everything he believed about honor, destiny, and what it truly meant to save someone's life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain when Finn Riley first heard the sound that would change his life forever. It wasn't the usual creak of leather or the snort of his horse that broke the wilderness silence. It was something else entirely, a rhythmic splashing that didn't belong in these parts. He had been following the river for 3 days, keeping to the high ground where the view stretched for miles in every direction. The water below ran fast and deep, swollen from recent mountain storms that had turned gentle streams into a torrent. Most travelers avoided this route entirely, preferring the longer but safer paths through the valleys. The splashing grew louder as he approached the river's edge. Through the morning mist, he could make out a figure in the water, someone fighting against the current with a quiet persistence. But something was wrong. The person was losing ground, being swept downstream toward a series of jagged rocks that jutted from the riverbed like broken teeth. Finn dismounted quickly, his boots finding purchase on the slippery bank. The figure in the water was moving with the controlled desperation of someone who refused to panic but was being overwhelmed by the river's raw power. The current was relentless, pulling the struggling form toward the rocks with each passing second. Without hesitation, he plunged into the icy water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he pushed forward, fighting his way through the churning rapids. The person ahead of him was a woman, he realized, but unlike any woman he had encountered in his years on the frontier. She was tall, with a slender but strong build, her long black hair streaming behind her like a banner of dark silk in the current. Her clothing was extraordinary, even while submerged. It wasn't buckskin or canvas, but fine fabric with elaborate embroidery that caught the morning light. The craftsmanship was exquisite, suggesting this was no ordinary traveler, but there was no time to wonder about her identity. The rocks were getting closer, and her strength was clearly failing. Finn reached her just as her head went under for the 3rd time. His arm locked around her waist, and he was surprised by her resilience, the wiry strength he felt beneath the wet silk. She didn't panic at his touch, didn't fight him as many drowning people did. Instead, she seemed to assess him even while struggling for air, her dark eyes meeting his with an intelligence that was both fierce and calculating. Together, they fought their way toward shore, the woman contributing what strength she had left to their escape from the river's grip. When they finally collapsed on the rocky bank, both gasping for breath, Finn found himself looking at someone who commanded respect, even while soaking wet and vulnerable. She studied him with those penetrating eyes. And for a moment, he felt like he was the one being scrutinized rather than the one who had done the rescuing. But as she stood to her full impressive height, wringing water from her long hair, Finn realized that saving her life might have been the easy part. The hard part was understanding why someone like her had been alone in such dangerous water in the first place. The woman's silence was more unsettling than any words could have been. She stood on the riverbank, water still dripping from her ruined silk dress, and regarded Finn with an expression that seemed to weigh and measure everything about him. When she finally spoke, it was in a language he didn't recognize, a cascade of soft, tonal sounds that suggested neither gratitude nor hostility, but something more complex that he couldn't decipher. Finn raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, pointing to himself. "Finn," he said simply. "Finn Riley." She tilted her head slightly, considering this information. Then she placed a hand on her chest and spoke a single word that sounded like a whisper of wind through bamboo. "My Lin." The formality of the introduction felt strange given that he had just pulled her from a raging river. But Finn sensed that with this woman, every gesture carried weight. She moved with a controlled grace, and despite her recent ordeal, there was nothing defeated about her posture. My Lin walked to where his horse stood patiently, studying the animal with the same intense scrutiny she had given Finn. She ran a hand along the horse's flank, and the animal responded to her touch with obvious approval. Even his horse, typically wary of strangers, seemed to recognize something authoritative in her presence. When she turned back to Finn, she gestured downstream, then shook her head with unmistakable firmness. The message was clear. Whatever had brought her to the dangerous stretch of river, she had no intention of continuing in that direction. Finn pointed toward his small camp in the distance, then to the sky, indicating the approaching evening. My Lin followed his gaze and nodded once, a single decisive movement that suggested she was making a calculated decision rather than simply accepting help. At his camp, she moved with the efficiency of someone comfortable with self-reliance. She helped him gather wood for the fire without being asked, her movements precise and economical. But she also kept glancing toward the eastern hills, as if expecting something or someone to appear. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their temporary shelter, Finn offered her dried meat from his supplies. She accepted it with a nod that might have been gratitude, though her expression remained guarded. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire the only sound between them. But when full darkness fell, My Lin became restless. She stood frequently, scanning the horizon with the alertness of someone who knew how to read danger in the landscape. Her hand occasionally moved to her side, where Finn noticed the empty sheath for a small blade beneath her tunic. Finally, she approached him and spoke again in her own language, this time with unmistakable urgency. She pointed to herself, then to the darkness beyond their fire, and shook her head emphatically. Then she pointed to him and made a gesture that clearly meant stay or wait. Before Finn could respond, she had gathered her still damp belongings and stepped into the shadows beyond the fire's light. He heard her movements for a few moments, then nothing but the normal sounds of the night wilderness. When morning came, she was gone. The only evidence of her presence was a set of footprints leading away from camp and a single, beautifully carved hairpin made of dark wood and inlaid with a small piece of jade, placed deliberately beside his bedroll. A hairpin that seemed far too personal and placed too precisely to be coincidental. As Finn examined the hairpin in the morning light, he couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with My Lin had been something more than a simple rescue. But what that something might be remained as mysterious as the woman herself. Finn spent the morning studying My Lin's footprints, trying to understand the story they told. The tracks led east into rugged country that would challenge any traveler, but they were deliberate, purposeful. This wasn't someone fleeing in panic. This was someone who knew exactly where she was going. He tucked the hairpin safely into his saddle bag and continued his own journey westward, but found himself constantly glancing toward the eastern hills where her trail had disappeared. The encounter had left him with more questions than answers, and questions had a way of eating at a man during long hours in the saddle. By evening, he had made camp in a defensible clearing when he heard them. The unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching with a steady, unhurried pace. The riders appeared as dark shapes against the twilight horizon, moving with a disciplined precision. As they drew closer, Finn counted 6 mounted figures. Their leader commanded attention even from a distance. He sat his horse with the kind of quiet authority that came from a lifetime of responsibility. As the group approached Finn's camp, that authority became even more apparent. He was older, perhaps 60 winters, with silver hair tied back neatly. His face was a map of experience, lined with wisdom and shrewd calculation. His clothing was of the finest silk, practical for riding yet clearly a statement of wealth and status. When the group stopped 20 feet from Finn's position, the leader dismounted with fluid grace. His dark eyes took in every detail of Finn's camp, his horse, his weapons, and finally Finn himself. The scrutiny felt thorough, like being evaluated by someone who could read a man's soul in the way he tied his knots. Behind him, Mylin dismounted as well. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than evaluation in her eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. "You are the man called Finn Riley," the leader said in English that was not only fluent but carried the careful cadence of a scholar. The statement hit Finn with force. He hadn't just known what happened, he knew his name. "I am," Finn managed, though the words felt inadequate. The man stepped closer, and Finn could see that his eyes held the same intelligent intensity he had noticed in Mylin. "I am Chen Wei. And this," he said, gesturing to Mylin, "is my daughter. She has told me of the man who risked his life for a stranger." A dozen questions formed in Finn's mind, but Chen Wei continued before he could voice any of them. "In our tradition, when a life is saved, a debt is created. A debt of honor that cannot be repaid with gold or goods. It is a bond that ties the savior to the saved. You have done something that requires a response of equal measure." The word response hung in the air with implications that Finn couldn't yet understand. But something in Chen Wei's tone suggested this conversation was about to become far more significant than a simple expression of parental gratitude. Chen Wei gestured for Finn to sit, transforming what could have been an intimidating confrontation into a formal meeting. His men remained mounted, silent and watchful. "My daughter was not in that river by accident," Chen Wei began, settling himself on a fallen log with an ease that belied his fine clothes. "She was returning from a journey to survey a pass through the mountains. A new route for our trade goods, one that would avoid the territory of a man who wishes us ill. A man named Barrett Kane." The pieces began falling into place in Finn's mind. Mylin hadn't been lost, she had been on a mission vital to her family, a mission that had nearly cost her life. The current was stronger than she expected, Chen Wei said, and for the first time, Finn heard a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "She is resourceful and strong, but the river shows mercy to no one." Finn nodded, remembering how even Mylin's determined struggle had been no match for the churning water. "She fought it well. But another few minutes." "Yes," Chen Wei said simply. "Another few minutes, and my family would have lost its future. My daughter is all I have." The weight of that revelation settled over Finn. He hadn't just pulled a woman from the river, he had saved the sole heir of what was clearly a significant and powerful family. "This is why we have come," Chen Wei continued, his voice taking on a formal tone. "To address the debt of honor." He looked at his daughter, and they exchanged a look of deep, unspoken understanding. Mylin then stepped forward. She stood before Finn, her posture poised and her gaze direct. She took a deep breath, and then she spoke, her English hesitant but clear. "Mr. Riley, my father has explained to me the custom of your people. That a man's life is his own to risk. But in my culture, a life saved belongs, in spirit, to the one who saved it." Finn's pulse quickened. He had no idea where this was going, but the seriousness in her eyes was captivating. "My family is establishing a life here," she went on, her voice gaining strength. "We have built a community, a place of peace and prosperity. But we are surrounded by men who see our success not with respect, but with greed. This Barat Kane wants our land, our water. He believes we are weak and will be easy to drive away. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. You are not a greedy man. You acted from courage, not for profit. You have a strength that is quiet, but true. I have seen it. My family needs an ally. Someone who understands this land and the men who inhabit it. Someone who is not afraid. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finn looked from Mai Lin to her father, who watched him with an unreadable expression. Then, Mai Lin met his gaze directly, her cheeks colored slightly but her eyes unwavering. A debt of honor must be paid with something of equal or greater value. I have nothing greater to offer than my own future. Finn Riley, I ask you to join my family. I ask you to marry me. The proposal struck Finn with the force of the river's current, leaving him speechless. This was the unexpected reward. Not gold, not land, but a life. A future. An alliance sealed by the most sacred vow a person could make. He stared at her, seeing not just a woman repaying a debt, but a leader making a strategic and deeply personal decision for the survival of her people. And he realized his answer would determine far more than just his own solitary path through the world.